This is the third and maybe final question mark in my series on adaptive card extension development. So far we've talked about state. And then last time I was here, we talked about making your adaptive card extensions lightweight, immediate, and personal. And this time I wanted to kind of bring those two concepts together and look at how we combine them to make dynamic experiences in our cards. So instead of rendering just a static card for folks to look at, how do we bring a little bit of dynamism into those cards, make them a little bit more like live tiles for those of you who talked about who's old with computers. If you remember, the Windows Phone had this fantastic live tiles experience. So I want to talk through three examples today here. The first one is actually called Dynamic Card 2 in the sample. I'm going to paste a link to all those samples in the chat right now, and you can view all that code that I'm going to show you there. It's ready today. So checking this one out, this is a simple text update, and it's a nice simulation of what it's like to have an email inbox. And you can see we've just got our text changing, and now I've got 23 unread messages. It'll be 24. And so something to think about here is this could be any kind of information around unread messages, unread tasks, newly assigned tasks. It's really, these samples aren't as much about the exact scenario as they are about just showing some techniques and patterns. So let's look at the code for this first sample here. These are just scaffolded ACE solutions, adaptive card extension solutions. Not a lot of stuff has been changed, the boilerplate stuff. Couple of quick things to highlight. We did add a property in the state to track that item count. On the init, we're setting that item count to 0. And then this is the general pattern I wanted to sort of show here today, is you just sort of, to get these updates, need to have sort of a reoccurring thing, a polling thing. This isn't sort of a new technology, but I wanted to boil it down to something very simple for this first example, where we create a function here that does something to manipulate the state. Now, this, of course, could be represented by web service calls, by graph calls, database lookups through some external service, whatever you might imagine here. But we're just updating the state, and then we're setting the timeout to essentially call our function again. This is an arbitrary number. I picked 3 seconds just for the demo, but this could come from properties. This could come from other values, other understanding of the situation and the scenario. But we're just incrementing the state each time. And this then brings that concept of state into play, where if we look now, this is our card view, what you were seeing on the screen. The only thing we do in our card view in the data property here is we get the item count from the state, and then we just output it onto the screen. So there's no other logic happening in the web part other than setting the state based on an expiring timer. And so that's sort of a very simple and basic way to bring some information, bring some dynamic content into your cards, is by simply updating the state and allowing the card to reflow, re-render as it would naturally, as you would expect it to do. And so if we look just real quick back at that again, you see I've now got 58, now 59 messages. I'm never going to get caught up. So let's go ahead and delete this one. And I'm going to add in, weirdly enough, I'm going to jump to number 3. It will be our next one here. And so this is an example of sort of rotating news items. And so you can see here as we go through, this is another very common scenario of I've gone and fetched some news articles. I want to show those to folks here. And so this is a nice rotator. So let's look at the code for that. I'm going to close those. We're going to open Dynamic Card 3, and we'll get the extension, and we'll get the card view. And so if we look at the extension, again, what we've done here is in the state, we've added an image and an index value to what was here from the scaffolded project. And as well, I've created this sort of static array of tuples here, which contain the headline and a string version of an SVG graphic. And that is all the data we need. Now, again, this data here is static for this demo because I wanted this demo to focus on the dynamic patterns versus a lot of web calls and having to parse data and understand things like that. But this, of course, would represent news articles from SharePoint, lists of users from Graph, however you might, want to display data or scroll through data. stock prices from Yahoo, wherever you might be getting your data. But the general pattern, again, remains the same. We set up our initial state. Here, I'm taking our description, and so we're accessing the first item in our info. That's going to be this one. And then the first piece of that, which is going to be this string. That's the title or the headline. And then the image, we're accessing the first item in that array and its second piece of information, which is that SVG. So we've got our image there. And again, I wanted to keep these patterns consistent and simple for all these demos. So you're going to see this in all three. We've got our fixture function, the same kind of set timeout pattern. Here, for no reason at all, I chose 4 seconds over 3 seconds just to show you something a little bit different. And then again, we're just pulling our index out of the state. We're doing a little math on our index. This is sort of a very simple, basic version of previous next paging, right? If we get to the end, we're going to reset back to 0. And then we're setting our state, as you saw above, with the first piece of whichever index we're at and the second piece of whichever index we're at for the description and image. And then we're saving whatever our calculated index was for next time, so we can calculate things next time. And then in the card view here, we're doing the exact same thing in our data. We pull out a state, our description, our image, and then we set our primary text and our image there. And that's all we need to do to have some dynamic content in our card. And we allow the ACE logic that's contained in the SharePoint framework code to reflow, re-render, and we get our updated things. So we got some headlines here. Peter Rabbit remembered, of course. The rabbit economy is doing excellent thanks to all our advances against the horses, and the horses have suffered another humiliating defeat. So just really relevant news, I think, for today. And then the last one I want to show you is one that Stefan Bauer actually put together and shared with me, and then I'm going to share with all of you. But this is a very cool demo of actually editing live an SVG graphic. So this is a dynamically generated SVG graphic that, as we can see, again, it's kind of a simple counter, but simple sort of hides a bit of the complexity in showing a dynamic SVG. So let's bounce over. We're going to look at the code to that real quick. We'll close those, and we're actually going to open the first one here. We'll again go to the extension, go to the card view. So in the state here, we've added a little timer counter. In our state, we set that to 0 to start things off. And then again, the exact same pattern, again, of creating a function, calling it, and having a timeout that calls it. 5 seconds, again, just no reason at all, just happened to choose that. And we're using that same pattern of setting our state, updating, in this case, the description, and updating the timer counter. So this is very similar to what you saw, in some of the other examples. Again, these examples aren't about making some complex code. They're rather just to show how simple it is to introduce some dynamic content into what you're doing. So if you come down here to our data, you're going to see the exact same pattern again, pulling the timer counter out of our state. Our primary text, we're going to update that with the strings here. And then our image URL, we're actually dynamically crafting, where before you saw I had some static SVG images as strings. Here we're dynamically crafting that and actually dropping some content into that SVG image. And that's done through this sort of little function here, which just has a giant string of a lot of the SVG stuff. Scroll all the way to the end, and we're actually dropping in our timer there. So you can see it showing up in this text block that's aligned. And if we bounce back to our screen, you'll see that's what's happening here. So our counter is going, and we've got some nice dynamic SVG stuff here. I did a little research. There's tons and tons of libraries out there for creating sort of dynamic SVGs, and a lot of different things you can do with that. So that'd be great ways to create moving graphs. Potentially you could have stock charts that are dynamically updating, all sorts of different things. So just want to introduce some great ideas to you, hopefully give you some ideas as well as some patterns here that you can use. Again, the patterns themselves aren't complex. It might be complex to get the web data. There might be some complexity around processing that web data, but the actual pattern of introducing dynamic stuff into your adaptive card extensions is pretty simple. Here I've just used, let me bounce over the code just one final time. Here I've pretty much just used a timer and set the state, and then you allow the functionality of these adaptive card extensions, very similar to React, to just reflow that content for you, update the display for you, and based on using the state here in that data property of your different cards. This one, of course, I did these just card views. Again, these were meant to be very simple demos. This same stuff applies to quick views. You can do the same kind of dynamic stuff within quick views as well, of course. So coming right back to our page real quick, and just wanted to finally show that all these things will sort of continue to update on their own. Each ace is a closure, so it maintains its own state, and so none of these things interfere with each other. And this gives you a much more dynamic dashboard with stuff happening and updating live, and that again brings in a little bit of immediacy and a little bit of personality to these cards and linking them to the people, drawing them into the functionality that you've built. And so with that, I'll see if there's any questions in the chat. Live tiles are back. That's exactly right. It's exactly the same kind of idea there. And with that, I have concluded my demo.
Thank you, Patrick. Really, really cool stuff, and great fast turnaround related on our discussion last week related on how can we do dynamic cards. So really, really cool stuff and helpful scenarios.